morning and happy Sabbath to you all. I would like to start with a question. Did you ever have to give an oath? Personally, I wouldn't start with my baptismal oath or word that I had to give when I was baptized at the age of 16. First time after that I was asked to give an oath was in the army. So when I was 25 years old, I went to the army because I had to do it. It was compulsory in our country at that time. And after 3 weeks of training, our commander was really serious when he came to us and tell us, guys, you're going to have a public oath. There's going to be several hundred of soldiers, all the family, so many people, and you're going to give an oath. And it's a serious thing. Why? Because if your country calls on you, you have to answer. If there is a war, if there is whatever is happening in the country, if your country needs you, you will have to answer because you gave an oath. Now, I was thinking about that because a lot of other guys, they were quite young, 18, 19 years old, and they didn't think a lot about it. It was just, you're proud that you can give an oath. It was a good thing. But I was thinking, am I going really to be serious about it? Am I going really to keep my word that if my country needs me in any kind of situation, I'm going to answer? Now, while I was having that conversation with myself, I have to share this with you, what I was thinking about. Almost 10 years before that, it was year 2000, and there was a revolution in Serbia, country that I come from, and I was 16 years old at that time. Some of you may remember the name of Slobodan Milošević. Right? He was the president at that time, and during the 1990s, we had 2 wars that we were involved in. Now, as a young person, I was growing up in those days, and coming into the high school, having this kind of environment that we are going to make revolution, that he's not going to be president anymore, I was really caught up into that. So there were protests in the streets, in the towns, throughout the country, and in my city, I was also going almost every day in those protests. Now, what we were actually really concerned about is, man, I don't want to go to war and die for who knows what politician. I want to live a normal life. So many people were thinking like that, and they were basically trying to make the change. Now, when you're 16 years old, you think that you can change this world, right? Like, I don't know if teenagers are here on Global Youth Day, but basically you have that in mind. Everything is possible. I can make the change in this world. I don't know if the older people would agree with that in a later age, but change is possible, and at that time I experienced that we made a change because it really did bring a change in the government. So, when I was in the army, I was thinking, there was a good time in the history of my country that country was making a decision that I wouldn't agree with. So, if my country would call on me because of my oath, am I going to be serious to say, yes, I'm coming no matter what? So I made a decision, and this is now up to you to decide, is it a good decision or not? I'm going to be flexible with this oath. So if I see that the decision of my government is good, yes, I'm there. On the other hand, if I'm not so sure and convinced that it's a good decision, I'm just going to stay out. If you give an oath, can you be flexible about it? Well, the right answer is no. If you give your word, you should keep to your word. Is it about the marriage? Is it about army? About anything. If you give your word, are you a person who is going to keep your own word or not? Today we live in a society, in a world, where we have a lot of broken promises, a lot of unfaithful people, groups of people, and we are somehow used to that idea that the word of a person often doesn't mean a lot because people are not taking that seriously. But luckily, we have a Bible, and since we are people of the Bible, we should be different about this. Because faithfulness, once you say something and give your word and a promise, being faithful to that for us as Christians, is really important thing because it's a characteristic of God. Just to remind you that we are still in our Project Eden, and now we are in the part of the story after the creation and after the fall of humankind, where God is actually making clear what the solution is going to be. Slowly He is introducing certain ideas. And we have one of the key ideas in the Bible that we are going to study today, and that is the idea of covenant. God gave His word that He is going to bring us back to Eden. He is going to provide the solution. And what we are going to see in this is basically that He is the one initiating all of this and making covenant with us. Let's put it in modern terms. Do you like when someone asks that you should sign a contract? Let me give you an example. If you want to have a good phone, a phone deal or whatever, usually nowadays you would sign a contract that is at least 2 years, right? Something like that on the average. And sometimes people are reluctant to do that. It's 2 years. Maybe I don't like the phone after, I don't know, a year, and then I'm stuck with it in a way because the contract is still there. People usually are not very enthusiastic about jumping into the contract because it has certain rules, obligations, certain commitments. And today people usually, I don't know how is it about you, like to be free, especially from the lifelong commitments. But when God is giving His covenant to us, we shouldn't think about it just as a contract, because contract can be a technical, dry, lifeless thing. Covenant that God is giving to us is something that is transforming our life for eternity. It is a promise that is the best promise that you could ever get. Now, we're just going to go quickly through some of the covenants in the Bible. So there are several verses. So the first covenant is with Noah. We had a story about it, but I just like to point out a few things from that covenant. And this is the text from Genesis. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. What was this covenant about? That earth won't be destroyed by the flood ever again, right? But if you read the whole chapter, it basically talks about much more than just that. It is a promise about offspring, Noah's descendants. It is a promise about the land, what is going to happen on the earth, and how Noah and his family and his descendants are going to find a place there. So when you think about this, it's not just about the flood. It is actually promise about blessing of the people and of the land. And what would you say? Is this the covenant just between God and Noah, or do we have someone else? When we think about the world after the flood, we had just one family. That was Noah's family. When God made this covenant with Noah and his family, basically, He made the covenant with all the humanity, that the whole of the humanity is going to be blessed. So let's not think about this as a covenant between God and Noah. This is actually something that God is giving to all the humanity. But then we read further in the story how humanity failed again. We have Tower of Babel and so many other things where humanity basically again said, well, God, thank you for all of that, but we want to go bad again. Now, God is making another covenant with Abraham. And we read this text, famous text, saying, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. We have several covenants between God and Abraham in few chapters of Genesis. But this is maybe one of the most important ones because it's the first one. When God gives this promise and makes this covenant with Abraham, what would you say it's about? Again, it is about his descendants, a great nation, offspring. It is about a land that they're going to inherit. And again, is it just between God and Abraham? No, Abraham should be blessing to all the people of the earth. So when we think about the covenant that God is making with a person, He's not just making that covenant with one person, it's going to be, you're going to have the best life ever. No, He's actually saying, I'm going to bless you, but the blessing should be spread throughout all the earth. So this is the idea that we have for now. Can you already see how God is introducing the idea of Messiah? Messiah who is going to be the blessing for all the peoples of the earth. You have God giving a promise through a certain man or maybe a family that is going to extend to all the earth, for all the peoples. So it's not just about the person who is going to give, who is going to have a blessing. It's about all the earth. And then we see how Abraham's family had its ups and downs in fulfilling this covenant. And then we get to the next covenant that is between God and Israel. And the text that we just have read, it is an amazing text. It has several great ideas. If you missed it, you're just going to read once again through it, and then just to point out a few amazing ideas. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the earth to be His people, His treasured possession. Next. Thank you. It was not because you were more numerous than any other people that the Lord set His heart on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples. It was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath that He swore to your ancestors. Now let me just stop here. What God is actually saying here, you know that in Bible, God is referring to Israel as His beloved wife. It's a marriage relationship. And oftentimes, Israel is addressed as her or she. So let's use that. God is actually saying to His beloved wife, listen, you're not the prettiest. You're not the smartest. But I love you. Dear men, brethren, try today when you go back home, not in a church, please. You have your lunch with your family, with your wife. After that, you go and have some time for yourself. You sit down or lay down next to each other, and then look her in the eye and tell her, you're not the most prettiest woman in the world. You're not the brightest. Sometimes you don't smell the best. And just try to keep going on, right? For a few minutes. And at the end, try to tell her, but I love you. And I dare you next Sabbath to share the experience with all of us here, right? Somehow, this is one of the most romantic expressions in the Bible. God is saying, you're not the best, but you're mine, and I love you. And this is an amazing message because this beats all the romance. But sometimes we read this promise, this covenant, and we think, well, it's between God and His wife, Israel. But then when you read further, basically the whole covenant with Israel was about the blessing for all the earth. They will be blessed, but through them, all the earth shall be blessed. And then we are reading the story further on how Israel failed in that because they were keeping God in a certain way for themselves. They thought that they are special and that's it. And we are not going to go into some of the next covenants. We have a covenant with David later that is about the promise of Messiah, and then the new covenant where we see God constantly repeating certain characteristic that is of key importance for the covenant, and that is faithfulness. Even though a person, a family, or a nation fails to keep the covenant, he is always trying to find a way how he will fulfill the promise that he gave. And the promise is about restoring humanity to what it is supposed to be, to restoring you what you were originally created to be. Now I said there are some of the very, very important and interesting ideas that we find here. And I would like just to point out 3 ideas about this covenant between God and a people. Last week I was Skyping with my mom, and she asked me, what do you do? What's going on this week and everything? And I tell her I'm preparing the sermon slowly for Sabbath. And she's like, okay, so what's the sermon about? And I'm like, it's about covenant. And basically, straight away, she shoots, you know what's the best idea about the covenant for me? Like, I don't know. Is that God is actually the one initiating the covenant. Now, coming from mom, I didn't take it as a serious theologian, right? Authority, but I was thinking like, okay, I'm going to think about it. And then I read some stuff about the covenant. And it's interesting. I don't know if my mom is secretly theologian, but so many theologians are basically emphasizing this. This is one of the greatest ideas. We are not the ones initiating covenant with God. Whenever, almost every time you read it in the Bible, God is the one initiating covenant with the human kind, with people. Now, of course, people do give some promises to God, they make oaths, but every time when it's transforming, God is the one making a promise. For example, this is just one of the verses. This is the sign of covenant which I'm making between me and you. So who is making the covenant? Noah didn't come to God saying, well, listen, God, we had this flood, and we have to find a different solution for the mess that we are going to be in. So let's not make it. Why don't you put the rainbow in the clouds, and let's say that there is no more flood ever again? Okay, Noah didn't come with a proposal. God actually gave the idea and started the covenant. And almost every time when you read about the serious covenant, God is the one initiating it. Now, why is this such a great idea? In old times, with pagan gods, it was quite different. Because with pagan gods, a person would come and they would say, well, I need this and that, so I'm going to offer you this and that, and I'm expecting you to hold your end of the bargain. With God, with our God, it's different. He's basically saying, listen, I have the best idea for you, how to solve the whole situation. And I'm just asking of you to say yes. He's making all the plan. Why is it the good news? Because when you don't think about your situation, what can be the solution for the certain situation, there is someone who is thinking about that. And that is God. I don't know if you've ever been in that kind of a situation that is really tough, that you are struggling, you're stuck, you have no idea how to resolve certain thing. And then someone else comes to you saying, listen, I was thinking about you, I was praying about you, and I'm going to do everything that is in my power to help you. And I give you my word for that. And they keep to their word. I don't know if you've ever been in that kind of a situation. God is basically saying that. I know that you can't get out of this by yourself, but I am proposing a solution, and I'm going to keep my word to bring it to the end. So that's the first idea. Second idea, really important also for us as Adventist people. Covenant is inclusive, not exclusive. The text that I have here is one of the best texts in the Bible that I love about the idea, how broad the idea of covenant is for God. So it's in Isaiah chapter 19. And the whole chapter is really interesting to read, but this is just the summary at the end. And God is saying, on that day, there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian will come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. If you read just before that, Assyrians and Egyptians are going to worship God, right? God of the Bible, Yahweh. And then the next text is really important. On that day, Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my heritage. Now let me ask you, who is the special nation? Who are the special people? Israel, right? Now, if Israel is the one called treasured possession, you are my people, I chose you, and all of those verses in the Bible. Does it look surprising that God is basically saying Israel will be third? Can you imagine being an Israelite, and then God is saying, well, listen, there are Egyptians, and there are Assyrians, and then there is you. Now, who were Egyptians? They're one of the first enemies of God's people, right? Who were Assyrians? When you read about them, that was one of the cruelest nations that existed at that time. And if you would think, well, what would be fair to do? Well, it would be fair for God to destroy those nations because of everything that they were doing to His treasured possession. Now, what God is saying here is that there will be a certain change. Those nations will worship God now together with Israel, and I believe that He said that on purpose. And Israel is going to be third with them. Now, my dear Adventist brothers and sisters, and maybe those who are not yet baptized Adventists, this is important for every denomination. Every denomination, even ours, thinks that we are special. That other churches are not as special to God as we are, right? You would agree or disagree with that, but most of the churches would say we have something that is making us special in the sight of God. How would you feel if God revealed to us today that Muslims, Hindus, Catholics, whoever, they're all going to come and worship Him, and Adventists are going to be third? Would you say amen to that? Yeah? Or would we say, well, aren't we the special people with a special message and being the one only true church? I'm not going to go deeply into that, but what God is saying here is that His idea of covenant, His idea of people, His idea of having people from this earth worshiping Him is much broader sometimes than our ideas of who is allowed to worship Him. So God is surprising us with this idea of covenant, saying, yeah, you are a blessed people. Don't make a mistake about it, but you are not the only one in this world. I want everyone to worship me and to be with me together. And the third idea is the idea of faithfulness. This is the great text that Paul is writing about, saying, if we are faithless or unfaithful, He remains faithful, for He cannot deny Himself. This is the best thing. When God gives the oath, when He steps into the covenant, it is part of His character, His personality, that He is going to be faithful to it. He is going to keep His word, even though we may be unfaithful. He is going to be faithful. Now, I want to just briefly, before we conclude, share my personal testimony about this. So these three ideas are really important, at least from my point of view, about the covenant. God is the one initiating it. He's the one starting, giving the idea. And also, He is much more inclusive than sometimes we may think. But also, even though we are sometimes unfaithful to the covenant that we make with God, He wants to try to find a way to bring us back to the covenant and to the original idea that He had for us. And He's going to do everything that He can. Now, I was born and raised as Adventist, but I decided to get baptized when I was 16 years old. So the year 2000 was a year of many changes. It was revolution in my country. I was in a way part of it. But it was revolution in my life because I decided to be baptized. Now, how did I decide about that? Make a decision about that? Well, a pastor approached me saying, hey, there are many of your friends being baptized this year. Do you want to get baptized? I don't know, make your own judgment. Is that the best question to ask in that way? So I said, yeah, why not? And then I was going through the Bible study and all of that, and I was baptized, 16 years old. Before that, looking from this perspective, I could say that I was a good boy, good young boy. We didn't have Adventist primary or secondary school in my city and all of that. So I was part of the public schools. And I had many friends in those schools. They were great, but they had bad habits. And I never got involved in any of that. So some of them would take their cigarettes and sign the date. Listen, Danilo, this is the date that I will stop to smoke. And I'm making this decision in front of you because I know that you will hold me accountable for it. You won't take it lightly. So I was really happy when I was experiencing something like that, and I never got involved in any of these things. Surprisingly, 4 months after baptism, I started getting involved in some of the things that are not very Adventist-like. And I don't want to tell the whole story, but I was still going to the church. Every Sabbath, during the week, all the youth activities and all of that. And I was living a different life outside of the church with friends of mine. And I would go to the church, and I would look sometimes at the people that I knew that also lived that kind of a life. Usually a bit older people. Coming to the church on Sabbath being all nice, but during the week I knew that they were doing some bad stuff. And I would say, those hypocrites. And you know how sometimes it's a good excuse for all of us, especially for a teenager, to say, I don't want to go to church because it's full of hypocrites. But if there are some teenagers here not going to the GYD, very often when we are saying, well, I don't want to go to church because there are many hypocrites, it's basically to cover our own hypocrisy. And I was doing that basically. I was living that kind of a life and pointing fingers at others. Now, it took me 4 years. It took me 4 years of that kind of a life to come back to God. But for most of the time, I didn't accept it that I am a hypocrite, that I am, bad in a way. It was kind of a good combination. It's a good time in a church, good time outside of the church. It's nice. But then there we had communion sometime after that. And I was participating in a communion every single time. But this time, deacons were taking the bread through the pews, and they came to me, and I took it automatically. And I was looking at that piece of bread that represents Christ's body. And I was thinking, is it fine for me to take it? Because I know what it represents. It represents that I actually accept His sacrifice, His forgiveness for sins, and I want to continue walking with Him in this covenant that I made with Him. And that was going through my mind. And I was already making a decision, I can't take it. I can't say yes to God and then continue living the way I am. And I decided just to put it aside, that piece of bread. That was haunting my mind. I just put it aside. I left it over there. I knew that my dad was somewhere over there, and he would probably sneak on me. Did I take the bread or not? That was in my mind, right? He probably wouldn't do that. But I was in a way afraid, if he sees me that I didn't take the bread, he's going to ask me the question, why didn't you take it? And I thought that maybe he and my mom, they don't know what I'm doing during the week. So I didn't want to be confronted with that. And basically, I just left it aside and made a decision. If they approach me, I'm going to tell them. Luckily, they didn't. And after some time, God started slowly to work on my heart. He was faithful, and I was unfaithful. I would go to my dad's tailor shop, and he would have some of the E.G. White books over there just to give to people. And there was a small book, short book. I was never a good reader. There was a tiny book about Christ's sufferings. And that was part of the Desire of Ages, like a small version of that. And I read that for the first time for myself. For the first time, I read it and experienced what Christ has actually done for me. And I went home. I was home when I was reading that. And I said to myself, I can't continue living like this. But I did. After some time, I was also making certain compromises. I was studying at that time for an IT degree. but I was usually wasting my time. In what way? I was playing computer games. The best way, because it's a computer, so it has connection with IT, and I'm doing something that I like. I don't have to study. But in a way, to make a compromise with that, I would play the Christian music in the background. Right? Good solution. If you're ever making certain sin or whatever, just put Christian music on. Surprisingly, at that time, certain song came up with great lyrics. And that song was talking about the way that a person is living their life. And God is actually stopping that person saying, hey, where are you going? What are you doing? And that person is lost, saying, well, I can't go back. And then God says, yeah, you can. And I want to bring you back. Okay, that was the beginning in my mind to say, wait a second. It is finally time for me to make a decision. Am I going to be serious about God or not? And then I took a book to read. Now, this is maybe not a book for 18-year-old guy to start reading, but it was a great controversy. It was, it's a big book. I didn't like the size, but I was like, okay, let's start reading that. I read about first Christians, about Christians in Middle Ages, about what's going on at the end of times. And I asked myself this question. If it came to this, that I need to give my life for Christ, would I do that? And it was a difficult question for me to answer. I don't know, what would you say? But I said at that time, I'm not sure. And it took me some time to say yes. But then another question, much more important, came to my mind. And that was this. Are you ready to give your life fully to God? Not to die for God, but to live for God. And that is much more different. Because I was 18, 19 years old, and that means I have a lot of years, hopefully, that I should live for the Lord. And I have to make a decision. And praise be to God, at that time, I made a decision and never came back from that again. Now, why am I mentioning this? I had my 4 years of unfaithfulness to God. I gave an oath when I was baptized that I'm going to be faithful. You know all the things that we list. And I didn't keep quite a lot of them. But God was faithful all the time. And He was working on bringing me back to the covenant with Him. So have this in mind, that God is faithful even when we are faithless. If you're experiencing in any way that maybe you have experienced this unfaithfulness to God, I would love you to have this in mind, that He is faithful even when you are not. Very often in our churches, we have several groups of people. Those who God is calling to make a decision about following Him for the first time maybe. And maybe today we have someone like that God is calling to make a decision to be baptized and to say yes to His proposal for the solution that He has. If it's difficult for you to make that kind of a commitment, and you think it's going to take away some of the things that I love, don't just pray about it, of course, pray about it. But really, really go deeply into your heart with God and try to see what is that holding you back, holding you from saying yes to God. For those who have already made that kind of a decision, maybe you're baptized maybe for a few years, maybe for many, many years, and you feel that you're not the best kind of husband or wife that your spouse should have, that you're not the best believer that your God should have this in mind, that even though when we are faithful, that we are unfaithful, He is faithful. And He wants you to come back. And He is doing everything that is in His power to get you back. The problem is sometimes, I had that problem, is that we don't accept the problem in our heart. We are saying, well, I am faithful, but actually we are not. So let God work on your heart and mind, convincing you of the step that you need to take. But there is also this third group usually in our churches. Third group that is great. You're faithful to God, everything is good, God is giving the blessings to you, and you are maybe a blessing to people around you. And I would like you to recognize that God is really holding to His promises that He gave you. And to be thankful for that, and to share that kind of a message with people struggling with this kind of idea of covenant and faithfulness. So in the end, we should keep in mind that God has given us the idea of covenant because that is His way of saying to us, I have solution for the problem that you're in. I'm going to do something and I just need you to say yes. And even if later you say, I'm not so sure, and you break the promise, God is going to be faithful to it. So, dear brothers and sisters, today we have a good news that God is bringing the victory of this whole story through His faithfulness. He is faithful to His promises. And I would love if you would experience that in your personal life. May God help us all with that. Amen.